Hello?
David, did you lie to them?
Comment on the allegations! David, look over here! Tell us the truth, David!
For 20 years, I believed I knew every version of my husband, David. I knew the way he took his coffee, the songs he hummed when he thought no one was listening, the exact tone of voice he used when he was lying about something small, like finishing the last slice of pie. I thought 2 decades of marriage meant I had seen every side of him worth seeing. I was wrong, and the moment I understood how wrong I was did not come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was cleaning out an old jacket pocket before donating it to a thrift store nearby. Inside that pocket was a folded receipt, soft and worn at the edges, the kind of paper you forget you are carrying until it falls into your hand at the worst possible moment. It was from a children's entertainment center 2 states away, dated for a birthday party package, complete with balloons, a cake, and a reserved table for 12. I stared at that receipt for a long time before the date registered. It was from a weekend David had told me, in careful detail, he would be spending at a work conference in another city entirely, a conference he described so specifically, I could have told you what the hotel breakfast looked like. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. This is not simply a story about a husband who strayed. Affairs are common enough that most of us know someone who has lived through one, survived it, and moved on with a story to tell at dinner parties. What I am about to tell you is different. This is the story of an entire second life, built quietly, patiently, over the course of years, hidden inside the gaps of a marriage that looked, from the outside, like one of the good ones. And it is the story of how I finally allowed myself to see what had been in front of me the entire time. For weeks after finding that receipt, I did what I imagine most women would do. I told myself a story that made sense. Maybe a colleague's child had a birthday, and David attended out of politeness. Maybe the date on the receipt was wrong, a printing error, a coincidence not worth losing sleep over. I have always been the kind of person who looks for the reasonable explanation first, the kind who gives people the benefit of the doubt, because doubting them felt, at the time, like a betrayal of my own. I did not yet understand that the real betrayal had already happened, long before I found that piece of paper. But small things have a way of gathering weight, once you finally let yourself notice them. A phone that used to sit face up on the kitchen counter started disappearing into his pocket the moment he walked through the door. A loyalty account for a hotel chain I had never once stayed at showed up in an old email, buried 3 folders deep. A name saved in his contacts that did not belong to any colleague, client, or friend he had ever mentioned in 20 years of marriage. Each one on its own meant nothing. Together, they began to form a shape I was not ready to look at directly. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when they start to suspect something they are not prepared to know for certain. I lived inside that silence for longer than I care to admit. I went through the motions of our life together, packing school lunches, attending parent-teacher conferences, sitting across from David at dinner while he told me, in that same familiar voice, about a client meeting that ran long or a flight that got delayed. I nodded. I asked follow-up questions, and underneath every ordinary conversation, a second conversation was happening in my mind, one where I was quietly building a case against the man I had promised the rest of my life to. What I did not know yet, what I could not have possibly guessed sitting at that kitchen table, was just how far back this went, how many years, how many holidays, How many birthdays of my own children had unknowingly overlapped with birthdays belonging to a family I did not know existed. I did not know there was a house 400 miles away with David's name on the deed. I did not know there was a woman living inside that house who believed, just as fully as I did, that she was his only wife. And I certainly did not know that the truth, when it finally arrived, would not come from David at all, but from a single piece of mail that was never meant to find its way into my hands. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next did not just change the way I saw my husband. It changed the way I saw 20 years of my own life, every memory I thought I understood, every version of the truth I had trusted without question. This is the story of how I found out, piece by piece, exactly who I had been married to all along. To understand how something like this can happen, you have to go back to the beginning, to a version of David that I still, even now, find myself missing at odd moments. We met when I was 24, working the front desk at a dental office in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. David came in for a routine cleaning, cracked a joke about hating the sound of the drill more than he hated Mondays, and asked me to dinner before he had even finished checking out. He was charming in a way that felt effortless rather than practiced, the kind of charm that made waitresses remember his name and made my own mother, notoriously difficult to impress, ask about him twice in one phone call. Looking back, I understand now that the ease with which David moved through the world, the way people simply believed him, was not an accident. It was a skill, but at 24, I only saw a man who made me laugh. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at my parents' church, the kind of wedding with folding chairs and a homemade cake, because neither of us had much money and neither of us cared. David worked in regional sales for a medical equipment company, a job that required travel from the very start, which felt normal enough at the time. Plenty of husbands traveled. My own father had spent a career on the road, and my mother had built a life around his absences without ever once questioning where he went. I suppose I inherited that same willingness to trust the shape of a marriage without asking too many questions about the parts I could not see. It never occurred to me that trust could be engineered, cultivated deliberately by someone who understood exactly how much space it would buy him. The first 10 years of our marriage were, by any honest measure, good ones. We had 2 children, a son named Ethan and a daughter named Claire, and David was, by every visible standard, a devoted father. He coached Ethan's Little League team for 3 seasons. He drove 2 hours each way to watch Claire's dance recitals when his schedule allowed it, and when it did not, he called during intermission just to hear how it went. Our neighbors described him, when everything eventually came out, as the last person they would have suspected of anything. That description has stayed with me, because I have come to understand that it is not a coincidence. Men who build second lives do not accidentally seem trustworthy. They work at it, the same way they work at everything else they intend to keep hidden. Around the 12th year of our marriage, the travel started to increase. David's territory had expanded, he told me, covering 3 additional states, which meant trips that used to last 2 nights began lasting 4 or 5. I remember asking him once, half joking, if he was going to forget what our house looked like. He laughed and said something about how the extra hours meant a better bonus, a bigger cushion for the kids' college funds. I believed him completely, in the way you believe someone you have built an entire life with, because doubting him would have meant doubting the foundation everything else was standing on. I did not yet understand that foundations can be hollow in places you have never thought to check. It was during this period, though I did not know it at the time, that David began building the second half of his life. I have since pieced together, through documents and conversations I never wanted to have, that he met a woman named Melissa during a work trip to a city he visited regularly for a regional sales conference. What began, according to what I later learned, as what he described to her as a troubled marriage on the verge of ending, grew over the following years into something that mirrored, almost exactly, the life he had already built with me. He courted her the same way he had courted me. He proposed to her, eventually, the same way he had proposed to me, on one knee, with the same kind of ring, purchased, I would later discover, from the very same jeweler. I did not know any of this while it was happening. What I noticed, instead, were the small shifts that accumulate so gradually, you can talk yourself out of seeing the pattern. David began keeping his phone locked, something he had never done before, and when I asked about it, he laughed it off as a work requirement, something about client confidentiality and company policy. He started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. He grew short with me when I asked too many questions about a trip, and then, almost as quickly, would overcorrect with flowers or an unplanned dinner out, the kind of gesture that felt less like romance and more, in hindsight, like damage control. At the time, I read it as stress. I did not yet have a reason to read it as anything else. The receipt I found in the jacket pocket was the first piece of evidence I could not explain away with stress or coincidence. But even after finding it, I spent nearly 2 months doing nothing but watching. I watched the way David checked his phone the moment he woke up, before he had even said good morning. I watched the way he angled his laptop screen away from the kitchen table when he used to leave it open without a second thought. I watched the calendar on the refrigerator fill up with trip after trip, each one described in just enough detail to sound legitimate, and just enough vagueness to make specifics hard to verify. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself 20 years did not disappear over a single receipt. And then I found the second thing. It was a credit card statement, one I was not supposed to see, that had been mailed to our house by mistake instead of to whatever address David had set up for it. I recognized his name on the account immediately, but the charges told a story I did not recognize at all. A furniture store in a city 3 states away. A pediatrician's office with a name I had never heard him mention. A florist, charged on a date I remembered clearly, because it was the same week he had told me he was stuck at a conference dealing with a difficult client. I sat at our kitchen table with that statement in my hands for over an hour, the house silent around me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had spent months refusing to look at directly. David was not simply having an affair. David was living another life. I did not confront him that night. I understand now why some people would have. But I have never been someone who moves before I am certain, and some instinct in me understood that if I said anything too soon, David would simply explain it away, the way he had explained away every small inconsistency for years, and I would lose whatever advantage I had in finally, truly knowing the truth. So instead, I began to build a case, quietly, the same way David had quietly built his second life. I opened a notebook I kept hidden in my closet and began writing down dates, charges, phone calls, anything that did not add up. I started paying closer attention to the mail. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice for years. It took another 3 weeks before I found the piece of information that changed everything. I had hired, at that point, a private investigator, a decision that felt almost absurd to make, sitting in my car in a strip mall parking lot, dialing a number I had found online for a woman named Patricia, who specialized in cases exactly like mine. Patricia was calm in a way that steadied me, and within 10 days, she had confirmed what the credit card statement had already suggested. David was maintaining a residence 400 miles from our home, under his own legal name, in a neighborhood not unlike our own, with manicured lawns and a school district rated highly enough that I found myself, absurdly, comparing it to Ethan and Claire's school before catching myself and remembering why I was looking at it at all. What Patricia found next was the detail that took the air out of my lungs entirely. David was not simply living with another woman, he was married to her. Not in the casual, unofficial sense some people use that word, but legally, on paper, with a marriage certificate filed 11 years after the one David and I had signed in that small church outside Columbus. Melissa Hart, the certificate read, now Melissa Coleman, married to a man she believed, as fully and completely as I once had, was entirely hers. She had no idea I existed. Her children, two of them, a boy and a girl close in age to my own, had no idea their father had another family living 400 miles away, celebrating birthdays and holidays on a calendar that, more than once, must have overlapped with our own without either family ever knowing. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters. When I first learned about Melissa, my instinct was anger, the kind of anger that wants a target, someone to blame besides the man who had built this entire structure of lies. But the more I learned, the more I understood that Melissa was not my enemy in any of this. She was, in every way that mattered, exactly what I had been. A woman who trusted a man who had made trusting him effortless. A woman who had built a life, raised children, celebrated anniversaries, all under the belief that she was the only one. When the truth eventually reached her, in a phone call I made myself, sitting in my car outside the private investigator's office because I could not bring myself to make it from inside our house, her first reaction was not disbelief. It was a silence I recognized immediately, because it was the same silence that had lived inside me for months. The weeks between learning the full truth and confronting David were, without question, the hardest of my life. I went through the motions of ordinary days, driving Claire to dance rehearsal, helping Ethan with algebra homework, sitting across from David at dinner while he told me, in that same easy voice, about a delayed flight or a difficult client, and I said nothing. I have thought many times since about why I waited as long as I did before confronting him, and I think the honest answer is that I needed to be certain there was no version of the story where I had misunderstood something, no explanation that could soften what I already knew to be true. I needed the confrontation to be one David could not talk his way out of, because I understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how good he was at talking his way out of things. I chose a Sunday afternoon, 3 days after Patricia handed me a folder containing copies of the marriage certificate, photographs of David with Melissa's children at a school event, and bank records that traced, in careful detail, exactly how he had funded 2 households on one income for over a decade. I asked David to sit down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had first read that credit card statement months earlier, and I placed the folder in front of him without a single word of introduction. I watched his face as he opened it, and I will remember that expression for the rest of my life, not because it showed guilt, though it did eventually, but because for the first few seconds, it showed something closer to relief, as though some part of him had been waiting 20 years for someone to finally catch him. David did not deny it. I think, on some level, he understood there was nothing left to deny. What followed instead was an explanation, delivered in pieces over the course of an hour, that I have turned over in my mind countless times since, and still do not fully understand. He told me he had never intended for it to happen this way, that what began as a temporary arrangement, a way of managing feelings he did not know how to walk away from, had simply continued, because stopping would have meant destroying 2 families instead of protecting both. He used the word protecting, and I remember feeling something close to disbelief at his ability, even in that moment, to frame 20 years of deception as an act of care. What David could not fully explain, what I do not think he has ever fully explained even to himself, was the mechanics of how he sustained it for so long. 2 mortgages, 2 sets of school tuition, 2 Christmases, 2 anniversaries, all managed through a web of accounts, a company credit card he used for personal expenses he later reimbursed in cash, and a travel schedule flexible enough to explain almost any absence. He told me he loved us both, a sentence that landed with a strange kind of violence, because I understood, hearing it, that it was probably true, and that the truth of it did not make what he had done any less devastating for either of the families he claimed to love. In the months that followed, the practical unraveling began, and it was, in its own way, as difficult as the discovery itself. Because David's marriage to Melissa had occurred while he was still legally married to me, it constituted bigamy under the law, a felony in the state where the second ceremony had taken place. Melissa, understandably, was left navigating a marriage that had never legally existed at all, despite 11 years of believing otherwise. I filed for divorce within weeks. David was eventually charged, and though the specifics of what followed in court moved slower than either of us expected, the case became, briefly, local news, a story reduced to a headline that could never fully capture what those years had actually contained. What I did not expect, in the middle of all of it, was Melissa. I assumed, when I first reached out to her, that whatever conversation we had would be brief and painful, two women confirming the worst about a man they had both loved. Instead, over the following months, something else developed, slowly and without either of us fully intending it. We began speaking regularly, comparing notes not out of bitterness but out of a strange, necessary solidarity. Two women trying to make sense of 2 decades that had run in parallel without either of us knowing. She told me things about David I had never known, small mannerisms, phrases he used, that mirrored our own marriage so closely it was almost eerie. I told her things in return. Somewhere in those conversations, something I never expected to find in the wreckage of my marriage began to take shape. Not quite friendship, not at first, but something close to it. There is a version of this story that ends simply with David's arrest, with 2 divorces finalized, with 2 families moving forward separately into lives that no longer included him at their center. But the truth, as it so often is, turned out to be more complicated than that. Nearly a year after the initial discovery, while helping David's attorney compile financial records for the ongoing case, I came across a third account, one that did not belong to either household I already knew about. It took several more weeks of careful digging, weeks I did not want to spend but felt I owed both myself and Melissa the certainty of pursuing, before I understood what that account represented. There had been, at various points over the years, a third relationship as well, shorter than the other 2, never resulting in marriage, but real enough to have produced a child David had been quietly supporting for the better part of 4 years without either Melissa or me ever suspecting a third life existed alongside our own. I share that final detail not to shock you further, though I understand it does, but because I think it matters for understanding the full shape of what David built. This was not a single lapse in judgment that grew into something larger than he intended. It was a pattern, a capacity for compartmentalization I still do not fully understand, sustained across more than a decade, touching more lives than either Melissa or I initially knew to count. When the third woman was eventually identified and reached out to, she reacted, as we had, with a silence that told its own story before she said a single word aloud. I think often about what it means to rebuild trust in your own judgment after something like this. For months after the divorce was finalized, I found myself second-guessing memories I had once considered unshakable, wondering which parts of our life together had been real and which parts had simply been performances I had believed completely. It has taken time, more time than I expected, to understand that my instincts were not the problem. My instincts, in fact, had been right more often than I gave them credit for, quietly noticing inconsistencies for years before I finally allowed myself to trust what they were telling me. The failure was never in my ability to see clearly. It was in how long I allowed myself to be talked out of what I was already seeing. Ethan and Claire have had their own paths through all of this, ones I have tried, imperfectly, to help them navigate without pretending the situation was simpler than it was. They know their father loved them, because I believe, in the ways he was capable of, that he did. They also know that love, on its own, does not excuse the kind of deception that reshaped their understanding of their own family history. Melissa's children have faced a version of the same reckoning, and though our families remain separate in most practical ways, there is an understanding between us now, an acknowledgement that our children share a father whose choices affected all of them equally, regardless of which household they grew up in. If there is a single thing I hope someone watching this takes away from my story, it is this: trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even when every visible piece of evidence suggests you have no reason to doubt the person standing in front of you. I spent years explaining away small inconsistencies because the alternative, doubting a marriage I had built my entire adult life around, felt
Mom, look
unbearable.
At the ducks on the pond.
I understand now
They are
that the
so
discomfort
cute.
of asking
We'll come
hard
back soon, I
questions
promise.
is almost always smaller than the discomfort of discovering, years later, exactly how much you were never allowed to know. My name is Sarah Coleman, and this is the story of the 20 years I thought I understood, and the truth that finally, painfully, and irreversibly set the record straight. How many of us have talked ourselves out of a feeling we were right to have? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story affected you the way it affected me to live through it, please consider subscribing, because there are more stories like this one still to tell.